So I'm sitting up in a tree, and I haven't really climbed very many trees in my adult life, but it seems like something that is something interesting to do. And I've been in California for 2 weeks now, and I haven't really had that much of a chance to sit and talk to myself. And luckily I have had opportunities to talk with other people, which was part of what I was imagining would happen. But I do feel like my brain isn't as actively learning as it was when I was talking with myself every day. But then the talking with myself also got to this point where it was kind of all that I was doing. So I had to sit on my couch and have that conversation with myself. So part of it is being able to have this conversation with myself, well, anywhere. And I might try and add stuff to my blog. And I was talking about how the internet's not as fast, so it's difficult to edit and upload so much video. So I'm going to try this audio thing. And just start again to seed this conversation with myself. It feels like I'm starting over. Partly because I'm in a different environment, so the technical aspects are different, but also being in a different environment, I don't actually feel like the whole mental patient context is as upfront and center, though it's still there. And I had quite a few magical moments when I first got to California, but those have subsided somewhat. And I haven't been eating healthy at all. So I feel like some of the physical, logical aspects I haven't really adapted to yet. And maybe that is a good thing. I'm really not sure. And another thing I noticed while being in conversation and dialogue with other people is that there's less need for editing because the other person generates what will be talked about next. Each person is sort of passing the energy back and forth, whereas when I'm talking to myself, oftentimes I'll talk about insights that came to me throughout the day. And those insights have been fewer, but I feel maybe it's because some of my perception capacity is devoted to mapping this new territory, this actual physical territory, and settling in and getting a sense of what it is that I will unfold here. I feel like a seed that will be unfolding something in this other environment, and I really don't know what it is. So there's a lot of different aspects there. And maybe once that energy is settled somewhat, I'll have more opportunity for self-dialogue. And again, I don't really want to be spending so much time editing. So I'm wondering if I can have more dialogue with myself without having to edit so much, and maybe make that part of this next part of self-dialogue, which is just having it more conversational with myself than having these intentional points to talk about. I guess in a way, it would be cool to have someone to just talk about them with instead of talking to myself about them. And perhaps people here might be willing to have dialogue and maybe record it together. It might be more powerful than just talking to myself. But the benefit of talking to myself is I can talk about exactly what I want to talk about, or exactly what wants to come through me, and I don't necessarily have to impose it on another person in that moment that it comes up. So I feel it is important for me to continue this conversation with myself, because in a way it's self-directed brain growth, and it's not dependent on others. And even just being where I am right now, getting a sense of how to engage in dialogue with people randomly, because it's something new. And I wonder if there's certain people that would want to have dialogue in this way, whereas other people might not want to. And if I did find somebody that wanted to have dialogue in this way, that perhaps there would be a lot of energy and power behind that. I almost feel like inviting someone into dialogue is like dating. We put so much emphasis on physical attraction and then going on dates and asking people out on a date. And inviting someone to have dialogue is almost like inviting someone to have a date, but in a different dimension, in this dimension of shared meaning and creating new meaning and thinking and seeing together, versus just having some kind of physical togetherness and that being somewhat satisfying, but there's a lot of energy that comes through this dialogue process that could be even more something that's necessary. We're designed to be together as human beings, but we can't all be together physically in that way that we all seek. But through dialogue, we can have a lot of togetherness in this other way, which could actually tone down some of the need for that other kind of physical togetherness, which only has a limited value. And I wonder if dialogue will help bring us up to that light body reality, whether or not it's true. There seems to be this different reality that's parallel and also flowing through this one that one can sort of switch into. And just as I say that, it feels like it's the reality of no self or no me. My little friends, the flies, are visiting me. I did think of flies as somewhat of a cleaner fish. It seems like they eat our dead skin and then in that way sort of pass on our DNA. I don't know if I like you though, you're pretty big. Go. He was a big, weird looking one. And sometimes you don't know if they're going to bite, but he didn't bite me, he just kind of looked at me. He landed on my finger. But I feel like the flies, they have this other purpose we don't know about. where they can tell by our dead skin DNA if we've sort of gotten to this point where we'll no longer harm them because we think they're these disgusting creatures. When we can actually see the value of every creature, high or low. And I think the flies are the ones that know this. There are cleaner fish. And then when we don't swat them away, they eat our dead skin, so then we can live forever in eternity. I would imagine that since humans often speak of eternity and eternal life and everlasting life, that could only be designed into nature as part of nature itself. We're trying to alter our genetics and things for longevity, but it might actually just be altering our mimetics, our language, the way we use words, and right now we use them against ourselves in our own voice. But if we were using them to speak as Gaia because we saw as Gaia and saw the relationship and the beauty and the connection of the design of nature, then nature would allow us to live eternally by the way it's designed. And it's probably a very simple design that we shoo away and think is disgusting. But that's just based on our limited perception. And this quantum light domain, this eternal light domain, and maybe that's what it is, it's eternal light, not really eternal life. Because life is light, it's all made from the sun. But it overlaps with this whole material reality. I just heard a stick break, and it sounded like something heavy enough to break a stick, and I decided to get out of my tree and give way to whatever it is in this area here. And I think part of this continued conversation, it has to be a little bit more organic than sitting there and editing. There might be a few more sniffs and coughs and wind blowing. Because if I try to make it this habitual thing, I don't want to be sitting indoors making it this habitual thing, so. And I wonder what the traits of clear perception are. I feel like if we didn't have our past memories of ourselves, we would all perceptually be basically the same. And if we were all blank slates, we would likely speak a language of seeing things together, pointing things out and talking about it and understanding it, versus talking about our past or projecting our past onto the present moment. And there's certain behaviors and traits and gestures that go along with clear perception. And I was thinking about beliefs in terms of meanings and how some of these other states of consciousness are actually meaning-making states. In a way, they're self-dialogue states, because one is often making a lot of meanings and seeing a lot of meanings and then thinking and talking about them to oneself, because other people aren't in that mode of perception. They aren't in dialogue. They're in the past. So it seems like the universal energy can put the brain into a dialogue state, which is learning and making meaning. But when we hold beliefs, if we hold X belief, Y belief, Z belief, we're holding on to those as meanings, And by holding those as meanings, as programs, then we're not able to see new meanings. We're not able to make meanings of what's there right now, because we're always projecting our program meanings on to the moment. So each moment can have a new meaning. And so imagine 60 meanings an hour, one a minute, or even 60 meanings a minute, which is possibly what happens when one first goes into a state that might be called mania. Now, it seems like that's too many meanings. But in that sense, a person that goes into trance consciousness or manic consciousness can have an experience of more meanings in a minute than most people have in one lifetime, because we hold on to meanings as programs. And there's a richness of meaning every moment. But we don't see that because we're holding so tightly to these beliefs, these stories. And by doing that, we're not allowing nature and the world and each moment to tell us a story. The story of the moment, and we're not able to speak as the moment and speak as the story of the moment and the meaning of the moment, which could be something shared. But we hang on to beliefs as this sense of security. But if we were all seeing clearly together, we would likely see the same meaning in the moment without having to hold on to old meanings, to have a pattern to abide by via those old meanings. I feel like if we actually knew what our brains could really do, we would drop that old stuff instantaneously. If we can see, we can make any meanings. And meanings that we hold are measures. We're trying to get reality to measure up to that meaning projected from the past, instead of being with that moment and what it's saying. Think about how powerful laughter is. It's a moment of sharing meaning, and then we actually have this physical reaction when we see the same thing together. Well, dialogue can be like laughter, even though it's not humor and not funny, but it's about seeing those meanings, and there's a shared energy that actually is amplified. Just like in laughter, there's an energy that's amplified to the point where we actually physically respond, and it's a bonding thing as well. And the same happens with dialogue. When we see and understand the same thing together at the same time, there's an energy there. If we think about the creativity involved in laughter and how infinite that is, and all the different meanings and the energy that's shared that makes us laugh, I feel like there's a similar infinity involved in dialogue. Whereas if somebody is talking about the shared meanings in religion, even people of the same religion can largely divert on their opinions about things and different religions. So it can be used more divisively, even though humor can be used divisively as well. And so a comedian can make funny meanings that others can see as funny. It's shared meaning. And maybe there's a place for a dialogician, somebody who can speak in a way that others can see what they're saying, and not speaking about one's personal self. So again, when we are making stories in our head, we can't see the story unfolding in front of our eyes. Why do we make stories? Why do we make sounds? Why do we string sounds together and make stories in our brain? We've turned our brain into this story of me making mechanism. And I feel like since medications dull perception that one might become in touch with through the map consciousness, trans consciousness process, I feel like some of those perceptions can be pruned out through dialogue and then maybe decrease the necessity for the numbing medications. When the dialogue process is reinforced to the point where dialogue is the brain's default mechanism as opposed to this hyper energetic process that gets activated and is almost so-called out of control because one is not used to those powerful sounds coming through one's brain. One's used to the limited sounds of thinking about oneself. And I feel like we're seeing new meanings instead of thought. And since we're seeing new meanings and talking about them, it's equated with being mentally ill because usually we're accustomed to talking about past memories and our goals and things of that nature. It's almost like this self-dialogue that starts, that wants to invite dialogue with other people about other things, about something else that's meaningful besides the me. It's almost like we're being kept in this process of me. Because, in a way, believing in me is even more fundamental than one believing in God. Perhaps believing in God creates the me in a way because there's a duality there. And it seems like thought thinks new meanings are mental illness. So there's a system of thought around how to care for people who start to have other meanings. So it's a process of seeing meaning instead of seeing one's own old thoughts. It's a new state of the brain. It's connecting with something new, a new energy, an energy that creates different memes and words and language. And dialogue is a language of meaning. So this temporary meaningful state, such as a hallucination state, is turned into this lifelong mental illness. When maybe there's something in the brain that switches to this meaning-making state just in the moment when somebody really needs meaning in life. And the trouble could be in navigating through the world of thought. The world of thought has a certain algorithm. When the brain has gone into this new energy state of the algorithm of perception, dialogue, and meaning. And it's interesting, as it's a time in humanity when we need new meanings. Yet brains that go into that state and are able to see that and harvest that and give voice to that are seen as mentally ill. To see anything beyond the limited thought complex of collective society is seen as mental illness when we desperately need to break that barrier and go beyond that. And the very brains that are at the forefront of doing that are called mentally ill. And at the same time, we're being sold flow states. I feel like a dialogue contagion needs to be started, and a self-fulfilling prophecy contagion. And maybe it could even be called omnilogue, as dia sort of implies two, whereas omni is more an infinite prefix. Right now we have two meanings in thought, which is right or wrong, good or bad. And I feel like the only richness is that of perception. If you can't see, then you want every form of entertainment and pleasure. And pleasure blocks seeing, and I talked about that a lot before. And in dialogue, we use words in order to see something, to create something, to create meaning. It's in the order of seeing, vision, and perception. And I feel like using words in this way creates new memes and changes our genetics as well, and grows the brain. And so there's vision, and then there's division. And the division is of thought. And I feel like thought, as in old memories, stored in our own voice, are actually poison. And perhaps speaking nonsense in the beginning of the map consciousness process is a sign that a person needs dialogue and they need reconnection. But it's not just that. It's that a person engaged in dialogue, when they're in that state, will actually help to change the brain of those who engage in dialogue with the person who is in that hyper-meaning state. It's not just about reconnecting the person to reality, but also learning from that person in that state. It's difficult to translate. They're speaking a different language, and even though it might be the same language that the group speaks, it's still a different language. It's a language of dialogue. A person is connected with that hyper meaning making state, and we all need more meaning. So because we're all lacking that meaning, some of us are in hyper meaning, but that can be seeded and shared and energetically dissipated to other brains who, if listening compassionately and non-judgmentally, and also in order to learn something from that person too, not just labeling them as pathologized, then that energy will be shared. It will be shared meaning. So the meaning that is normally tried to be shared with that is, you have this mental illness. It's just a belief system. And a lot of that is because what the person in question is saying is kind of unbelievable. But with enough dialogue, there could be some meaning shared together, and that would have a lot of power behind it. A person in that confused and scared and meaning-making state is asking for help, just as a drowning person is asking for help when they're flailing around. They're asking for help without saying, "Can you help me?" A person connected to map consciousness, when it gets confusing and scary, they're drowning in words, they're drowning in thoughts, they're drowning in perceptions, and they need help to connect with other brains to get their brain to come back into some